Hi everyone, welcome back to my booktube channel Lisa and Bookland. Today I'm here to bring you my December reading wrap up for 2022. So I read 18 books in December, which sounds like an outrageous amount, but it actually, when I looked at the number of pages that I read in December, I actually had read around the same amount of pages as in November. So I was obviously reading shorter books, and I also did a bit of like tidying up of books that I was halfway through and things. So yeah, it's not as outrageous as it seems. Though obviously with Christmas holidays I did get to read a little bit more, which is always nice. But before we get into the December books, I just want to mention one book I actually forgot to include in my November reading wrap up because I listened to it on audiobook and I hadn't written it down in my book journal for some reason, and that is The Hollow Crown by Dan Jones. I actually started reading this book in September for Tudor-tember, and it's a non-fiction book about the War of the Roses. So in Tudor-tember I read a fiction book about the War of the Roses, and I was like, it's a period I don't really know an awful lot about, and I just looked up random books about that period on Audible, and this is the one that sounded attractive to me, and I liked the narrator in that, who's actually Dan Jones himself, so I picked it up. And I did enjoy it, and I would say that I got an overall feel for the period of the War of the Roses. It is very complicated, and because I didn't know a lot about it or nearly anything about it at the start apart from that it had happened and it somehow ended up with Henry VIII on the throne, because of that I found the audiobook, although it was very well read and Dan Jones wrote a great book, I did find I lost the thread of it at an odd time. I'd have forgotten who a person was when they appeared or what they'd done before they got exiled to like France or somewhere when they came back with an army or something. So it was a good book. I think it would be better if I read it in a physical copy so I could take my time with it and take notes and like reference things back. So I don't know if I'd bother reading another War of the Roses book because I did enjoy this one. I think I would reread this one, and hopefully retain more this time. But yeah, I did succeed in what I wanted, I suppose, was just to give me an overall feel for what in the world is going on. So I do hope the physical book has that like list of people at the start and what they did that some non-fiction books have, because that would be really useful. I know Dan Jones has written other books and I will pick them up because I really liked his writing style. But yeah, on to the December books. So the first book I'm going to talk about is a classic, and this is another book that was left over from September, this time from Shakespeare, and that's Hamlet by William Shakespeare. In September I think I read up to Act 2, and in December I read the final 3 acts just to polish it off. As you can see from this copy, it's my Leaving Cert copy. It's the play we studied for Leaving Cert. So it was a reread for me. I did enjoy it on the whole. Shakespeare obviously is a renowned writer, and I like some of his like quippy lines, and a lot of places do make me smile. But sometimes he's just a bit too long-winded for me. But I am kind of conscious as well that I am very familiar with the plot of Hamlet, obviously having studied it. So I will never say that I like gave up on Shakespeare, because as part of Leaving Cert we actually went to see a performance, and I really loved the performance, and I'm conscious that Shakespeare is supposed to be performed and not read. I do have a CD of Macbeth. In March I'm going to be taking a staycation, and I know I'll be doing a good bit of driving during that holiday, so yeah, I think I'll listen to Macbeth in March. But yeah, like Shakespeare, I don't think I'll ever be his biggest fan, but it was nice to return to Hamlet, and even just to see my writing from 10 years ago and see what the teacher told us to look out for. So yeah, it was an interesting experience. So the next book I'm going to talk about was on my priority reads for 2022 list, and that is The Great Passion by James Runcie, who I believe is most well known for the Grantchester Chronicles. I've never actually read those. I did love his writing in this, so yeah, it's something I definitely would consider picking up. I think those are mysteries. This book is very, very different, as in it's a historical fiction novel that deals with a chorister that's at a school that he was studying under J.S. Bach, the composer, and the interactions that he has with Bach's family. I didn't really know anything about Bach before or anything. The one thing I did know, I suppose, is the volume of music that he did compose, like church music. He had to write like new music for a sermon like every Sunday. Such an unbelievable output of work, and this book definitely captures kind of how he managed to do that. Because I don't know much about Bach, it was interesting to me the parts about his family, who are obviously extremely musical and quite unusual at some point. So I really liked Stefan's interactions with them. The one thing I will say is this is, as you can probably probably tell from the sheet music on the cover and the topic, like this book is extremely about music. I loved it because I never studied music or anything, but I do have a little bit of knowledge of classical music, and I did sing in a choir at one point. So I think if you didn't have any kind of background in music or classical music or singing, you might find it a little bit boring or like maybe dry, but I really enjoyed those little details, and especially it was a nice book for Christmas, I suppose. The one thing I wish I did do, which I didn't do, is there's a lot of German as well, because this book really, at the back it says it's about the writing of St. Matthew's Passion, but that's really only like the last part, but it is probably the most important part of the book, and there's like extracts from the Passion which is all in German, and you know, he's describing why he's making like a certain singer sing that part, or why he's using that particular type of music for that chorus. And yeah, because I couldn't understand the German, some of that went over my head, but yeah, I could definitely see myself rereading it, and on a reread I would think I would just write in translation in German for myself. But yeah, it's a very, very slow moving novel. It's just covered 1 year of Stefan at school, you know, if even a year, probably more like 9 months. So yeah, not a huge amount happens, but if you love music, especially if you've got a background in classical music, I think you'd enjoy this book. So it's funny that the next book I'm going to talk about is also a historical fiction book that has a historical composer as one of the characters, and that's Briefly a Delicious Life by Nell. So, well, like, the composer isn't the main character. I was definitely really intrigued by the premise of this book. So this book is told from the perspective of a 14-year-old ghost who has died several centuries ago, and she's haunting this monastery. There used to be monks there, but they've since moved out, and the main action of the book is when the Chopin family move in. So both Frederick Chopin, the famous composer, and George Sand and George's children. Again, these aren't figures I knew anything about. George Sand definitely was a very interesting historical woman. She dressed in man's clothes, and she was a writer, and yeah, she definitely was before her time, I suppose. But yeah, the ghost is watching these moving in, gets very involved in their lives. I don't really want to give any spoilers, but the ghost, suffice to say, has seen a lot throughout her time haunting the monastery, and there's like a really interesting way the story is told, in where, you know, we can see the present time, but also like we can access other timelines as well to find out more background without it being like too like info dumpy or like being like a flashback, you know. So I really, really liked the way the story was told, and it was really enjoyable. There's great LGBT representation in this book as well. The book was really moving. It's sad at times. It actually reminded me quite a lot of Hamlet, in that, like, looking at each of the family members and kind of their own individual troubles and that. So, and it also had like a brilliant ending. It was hard to kind of know what way it would end, you know, with the ghost, but no, it was a really great ending. I really agreed with it. As I said, I listened to the audiobook, which I think was a great medium to consume this book by, because it felt like the ghost was talking to you directly, which, you know, you get with a physical copy as well, but probably more strongly with the audiobook. So yeah, no, it was a really good read, really enjoyed it, and yeah, would recommend. So jumping forward to the Regency period, I read this book, A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting by Sophie Irwin. I actually had owned this book since July, and I wanted to read it at Jane Austen July, but I just didn't get to it, and it's a new release from this year. First line in the back cover really describes all. Katie Talbot needs a fortune, or rather she needs a husband who has a fortune. This is 1818 after all, and only men have the privilege of seeking their own riches. So Kitty is from more lower class family down the country, and her family come into financial troubles, so she goes to London to try and find a wealthy husband to basically rescue them all. So yeah, like, you can guess how it goes on from there. It was just a really fun little Regency romance book with like extra themes as well, and yeah, no, I really liked the way in particular like moved between perspectives quite like flawlessly. So yeah, you kind of got everybody's side of the bargain, and yeah, really, really fun. One to consider for Jane Austen July next year, definitely. So I did read a little bit of non-fiction this month, including this book, which is Erebus, The Story of a Ship by Michael Palin. This is another book that was on my priority reads for 2022, but yeah, this is a book I'd had my eye on for a good while, although I never encountered Michael Palin before, either in reading form or on television. Somehow I know he's really well-known travel writer, I think. It was intriguing that this followed the entire story of the ship as well, because I did read a book last year, Endeavour, the story of a ship, which did the same thing. It was by a different author, no other connection. And just it was exciting to see all the variation of journeys that the ship went on. Not quite so varied journey for the Erebus, but it was still really cool to see the Antarctic expedition it did under Ross before the Franklin expedition, which is the most thing I know about Erebus. I had encountered the expedition slightly before, but I'd forgotten a lot of it, and I definitely need to read more about it. Michael Palin definitely writes really well. It was so engaging and definitely very enjoyable to read, very fast read as well. It is always a bit disappointing when the information tails off in the Franklin expedition after the last sighting, but he can't do anything about that. I always just kind of get frustrated when I get to that section of these books. But one strength I have to say this book had was it really dissected Inuit testimonies of the Franklin expedition in way more detail than I'd seen before, and it's unbelievable really that more credence weren't given to them at the time to find out what happened. But it was just a real strength of this book, and obviously it was really nice to read about the rediscovery of the Erebus and the Terror as well. And I think they're going to start excavating the wrecks again soon after COVID. It had kind of been put on hold for COVID, I think, like a lot of things. So I've followed loads of pages on Instagram trying to wait for updates for that. So yeah, exciting times, and I'll definitely be checking out more Michael Palin for travelogues. The next book I'm going to talk about is a Victorian classic which I got for Christmas, and that's this book, The Trumpet Major by Thomas Hardy. So earlier in the year I read Tess the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy, and I absolutely loved it, and I was like, I have to read more Thomas Hardy, so I asked for it for Christmas, and I got this one and two others, The Woodlanders and The Return of the Native. And I've always been understandably drawn to this Thomas Hardy because I know it's a historical fiction novel that's set during the Napoleonic Wars, although it is a Victorian novel. So like Vanity Fair, I suppose, and I read Vanity Fair this year as well. I suppose it's a bit interesting to read them near enough to each other. I will say that this book isn't quite as striking as Tess. It's hard to say that I prefer Tess, but I can see that Tess is probably a better novel. But The Trumpet Major follows a way more, I suppose, down-to-earth storyline. Anne is the main character. She lives with her mother in a mill, and the miller lives in another part of the mill, they're his tenants, and they kind of interact with his family in some nice ways. It follows Anne's various romantic entanglements. I suppose the main action of the book takes place when an army regiment comes and camps near them, just at a period when there's a big fear that Britain is going to be invaded by France as part of the Napoleonic Wars. I think this is about set in 1804, before the Battle of Trafalgar. So obviously causes a bit of uprooting in the community. It will arrive back that Anne hasn't seen for a while. I think one of the highlights of this book is a relationship that there is between two brothers. It's such an interesting part of the book, and it's always nice to read about a nice sibling relationship. What I loved about this book as well is it's really consciously historical fiction. It's not as in future events are referred to within the text, and future fates of characters, and I just found that really interesting and really added to the book. When you're following these characters, then the author kind of interjects when he's talking about the army, and he's like, oh, some of these will be dead in the fields of Waterloo in 10 years time or whatever. So it made it a bit more poignant to everything that was happening in the book, and did deliver some gut punches. So it was just a great book, and I really enjoyed it. Now that I'm talking about, maybe I preferred it than Tess. Tess is a bit of a masterpiece, or as far as I can tell. The Trumpet Major is maybe a bit more lighter reading, maybe. I did really, really love this, and I can't wait to read more Thomas Hardy. I'm so glad I've started this adventure again. So next I'm going to talk about another Victorian novel, and that's The Real Charlotte by Edith Somerville and Violet Martin Ross. Actually, I filmed a full book review on this, which will be coming out in early January, because I wanted to give it a little bit more time than I could here when I have so many books to talk about. But I really, really enjoyed this book. It is an Irish Victorian classic. Edith Somerville and Violet Martin Ross were two Irish women, and this is set around 1894. It says that this is a brilliant portrait of the golden summer of Irish society. This novel follows two main characters. So Francie Fitzpatrick is, I think, 18 or 19 years old. She's been brought up in kind of a lower middle class background in Dublin, and for various circumstances she gets sent down to the country to live with her older cousin, Charlotte. She's a wealthy spinster. She lives alone with a servant and many cats. So yeah, she's a great character. It mostly follows like Francie's romantic entanglements with various people, some of which are not very nice at all, some of which are a bit more likeable. The Dysarts are kind of the local gentry family, so they come into it quite a bit as well. And yeah, this book was also very funny at times. And like I am always interested in like Anglo-Irish novels. I've only read I read The Last September a while ago, which is probably the most obvious other one. But I'd like to read more. I suppose it's like there's always a curiosity to see like the other side. Do you know when you see these like the ruins of these big houses standing around, like a lot of them were burned in the War of Independence and the Civil War. Do you know how people used to live in there? And what I'm really interested in this book as well is like the differences between society in England, which is what I read about in most classics, and society in Ireland. Like from what I've read, it appears like the distinction between the classes in Ireland was a lot smaller than it was in England, so that's always just interesting to spot those differences as a complete non-expert in Victorian society. But yeah, no, I really like this book, and I liked it a lot more than the Irish RM, because as funny as that book was, this was more of a like really tight novel with beginning, middle and end, rather than the Irish RM, which was more like episodic. But yeah, would really recommend this book. I really enjoyed it. The next is a French classic, and that is Claudine at School by Colette, which I have in this battered little hardcover copy. This is another one of my priority reads for 2022. This edition was translated by Janet Flanner. As the title would imply, it follows a girl called Claudine over her year at school. She actually goes to a boarding school, though she doesn't board herself. She's very proud. She is a bit older and is very intelligent, so she's kind of a leader of the other students. Though she's not very nice at times, she's always interesting to follow. I wouldn't say that like there are any earth-shattering events in this book. Like, it is, you know, more of a school story, but it in no way was like Enid Blyton or anything. I never read a classic, and I haven't read very diverse classics admittedly, but I've never read a classic which was so concerned with like teenage girls and like sexuality. Claudine actually has a relationship with one of her female teachers, not a very old teacher. It doesn't really come across as predatory, even though there are some uncomfortable moments in this book where like young girls are ogled by like older men. But yeah, I suppose, you know, a sign of the times. So yeah, like I enjoyed this for what it is. It was a quick little read, and I think it's part of a trilogy, and you know, Claudine was an interesting enough character that I think I probably would read the other books if I ever get the time. So yeah, it was grand, and it's nice to read something by Colette. I haven't seen the biopic that was released a few years ago with Keira Knightley, but I really do like Keira Knightley, so I'll probably watch it if it's ever on telly or anything. So another book that was on my priority reads for 2022 was The Dream of the Celt by Mario Vargas Llosa, which was translated from the Peruvian by Edith Grossman. So this is about the life of Roger Casement, who was a man that lived late 19th century, early 20th century. He worked as British consul in the Belgian Congo and the Amazon. Before, I suppose, how I'd have encountered him more is he actually became very sympathetic to Irish independence. He's from Ireland himself, and he was actually arrested and hanged for trying to import arms from Germany into Ireland for 1916. So I did enjoy this book on the whole, and I definitely learned a lot, but I will say that it's not an easy read, both because of the subject matter. He actually was knighted for his services in the Belgian Congo and the Amazon. He actually exposed awful atrocities that were taking place there. So these are definitely very graphically depicted in this book, but also because of the writing style, it was very odd. Like it was kind of an odd mix between a historical fiction and a biography, and it wasn't really either. Like it was historical fiction, as in we do see some of his thoughts, and you know, there's no references or anything, but there is like exact dates mentioned, and you're always at like a distance from the characters, so I found it hard to really empathize with them. Like a few years ago I read a historical fiction book about Roger Casement. I think was way more enjoyable, like readable. Sabina Murray's Valiant Gentleman, which I'd really recommend before you attempt this book. Maybe if you are very interested in Roger Casement, this might be more exacting to his life. Maybe Sabina Murray maybe took a bit of dramatic license when it was more fictionalized, but that book was less detailed but more compelling. But yeah, no, this book still was very interesting, and I did like his take on the Black Diaries. He kind of positioned that they were really written by Roger Casement, which we know now. I think there was DNA studies done of it, but they weren't things that he actually did. They were, I suppose, his own fantasies that he was committing to paper. So yeah, no, it was interesting, and I liked this as well, that it was told every second chapter. For one, it was in the past when he was in the Congo or in the Amazon, and then in the next chapter he'd be in Pentonville prison when he'd already been captured and charged with treason, and he gets talking to his prison officer who actually lost a son in the Somme, and obviously feels conflicted about Roger Casement, who was committing treasonous acts against the British government during the First World War. So, it was an interesting book, and Roger Casement, I suppose, it continues to be a really fascinating character. And I think it's a fault in Ireland that we focus just on the very end of his life for the Irish independence movement, and not what he did in the Congo and in the Amazon. He did such important work when he was very sick with malaria and things, and undoubtedly was a great Irishman. So it's something we could definitely improve on, I think, and I'm always glad to learn more about him. So more Irish history next, and this is another book on my priority reads for 2022. You can see there's a theme, and this is The Handover, Dublin Castle and the British Withdrawal from Ireland 1922 by John Gibney and Kate O'Malley. This is just a very nice non-fiction on a very specific topic. So Dublin Castle, it's not really a castle, it's kind of a complex of buildings which was like the centre of British administration in Ireland, and it was handed over to the Irish government after the Anglo-Irish Treaty 1921, so we could start taking our own administration under our hands, I suppose. This is a really interesting book for me, I suppose, to cover a topic that you don't actually hear a huge amount about this specific day, that this such a significant event happened. Also, it dispelled some myths. The most thing you'd think about the Handover Dublin Castle was in the Michael Collins movie, when all of the British Army are there, and then Michael Collins leads the Irish Army in, and the British general says that he's 7 minutes late. Apparently that did actually happen, but there was no big military display. It was very much just they arrived in some cars and went in. It was bumped up for the movies, but that movie is so integral to our culture now. But anyways, it did go through on the day itself. What we do know about it, there's a lot we don't know, unfortunately, but also kind of went through the press coverage of it, the wording surrender versus handover. A lot of the nationalist newspapers use the word surrender, which is maybe a bit stronger, and so the Dáil, and maybe that kind of was to try and boost the treaty as well, oh look what we've done, the treaty is great. So I also liked the little discussion at the end of the fate of Dublin Castle after independence. There was a lot of discussion about whether it was appropriate to use it as the new seat of government or not. It was decided not. Today, the main seat of government is in Leinster House, and there was proposals even that it should be knocked out altogether. The historical burden that it had. The one thing I did find is lacking in this book was a discussion of what Dublin Castle is used for today. I have to say I'm not really too sure. I know that the odd state banquet that there is, I know when Queen Elizabeth came to Ireland, the state banquet was in Dublin Castle, but we don't do ceremonial events like that often. So I just felt like that was lacking, but the next time I'm in Dublin I definitely will go in for a walk around. So I'm going to talk about the next 3 books together, I suppose, because they're all a series and by the same author, and they are Slippery Creatures, The Sugar Game and Subtle Blood by KJ Charles, which are the Will Darling trilogy. So in November I had read The Gentle Art of Fortune Hunting, and I absolutely love that. It's one of my favourite books of 2022. And I saw that the author was giving the first ebook of the series for free online, so I picked it up and said I'd read it. And I know it's one of her more popular series. I have to say I didn't enjoy this one as much as I liked The Gentle Art of Fortune Hunting. It was grand, but it didn't have that magic of the other one. It might just be because it's set in the early 20th century instead of the Regency period, which is obviously my favourite one. But I didn't find the characters quite as compelling, or I wasn't as invested in the relationships. Also, I found that there was a troubling amount of really casual violence in this, which I wasn't really expecting. But I suppose there was kind of a mystery or suspense element to these books that there wasn't in the other ones. So But anyways, what the books are about. The main character is Will Darling. He's just come back from fighting in the First World War. He doesn't have too much money, as a lot of soldiers didn't when they came back, but fortunately he inherits an antiquarian bookshop in London from his uncle, and he's just settling in, learning how the business is going to go, and all of these people start visiting him, looking for this letter, and actually attack him, so he ends up getting into trouble like that he doesn't know what the letter is about or what his uncle was involved in. So yeah, things kind of go on from there. It is a nice portrayal, I suppose, of the 20s. As with every KJ Charles, there's good LGBTQ plus representation. Yeah, they were good. I just didn't enjoy them quite as much as the Gentle Art of Fortune Hunting. But I'll still be trying other books by this author. Speaking of the First World War, this is a book that's been hanging around the house for a long time. I think my sister got it one Christmas. So it's The World at War. I couldn't see an author name in it. You know, it's a very basic overview of the First and Second World Wars. Lots of nice pictures. I did enjoy it for just, like, I suppose, a quick refresher on the First and Second World Wars, which I'm a bit rusty on. But it was a much more top level detail, I suppose, than I would like. But I did really enjoy the pictures, and it did manage to, like, condense a very huge and complicated time period to, like, something that would be understandable, I think, to maybe teenagers. So I'll be giving this to a charity shop where I think it might be interesting for, like, older primary school children, or more probably like junior cert level students. So next then is a children's book, and it's this book, The Bookshop on the Quay by Patricia Lynch, who is an Irish author. This is a children's classic, I suppose, as well. It was first published in 1956. Apparently Patricia Lynch is quite a well-known Irish children's author, but I can't remember having read any of her books before. Probably before my time. But the most thing I can remember about this book, I went to Westport, a town in Mayo, to do a little bit of pre-Christmas shopping, and I went into the antiquarian bookshop there, as you do. I'd never been there before, and I was looking around, and I picked up this book, and actually picked up one of Ernest Shackleton's books. But anyways, the person working in the bookshop asked me did I want to see a really old book, and I'm like, absolutely, show me a really old book. And he took down a book off the shelf that was printed in 1550, and it had an inscription inside from 1605 or something, and yeah, allowed me to touch it and everything. It was the oldest thing I've ever touched that wasn't a building. It was like all in Latin, of course. It was like some kind of religious text, but it was in perfect condition. The pages were made of linen, if you can believe it, so I was very excited and I was very happy, and I'm glad to have this book as a reminder of it. So this is the bookshop, West Coast Rare Books. So yeah, it was a lovely little shop, and Westport is a lovely town if you're ever in Ireland. But anyways, The Bookshop on the Quay. This is a really charming little book. It starts off really this family that owns this antiquarian bookshop in Dublin are having dinner, and they notice this little boy looking in the window. He's reading Gulliver's Travels, a book that's open on the windowsill. These other boys attempt to rob the shop, and the boy who's looking at Gulliver's Travels runs after them. So yeah, he ends up getting involved with the family. It was just a nice, charming little book. There's a very random ghostly appearance in this, which is funny, and also I did a complete coincidence, it actually ended on Christmas, so that was kind of nice. Who doesn't love a good book about a bookshop? And I actually read another book about a bookshop this month, and that is The Cashy Saved Books by Suzuki Natsukawa, which is a Japanese novel. It is translated by Louise Hill Kawai. This is about a boy. His grandfather owns a bookshop, and the grandfather very sadly dies. Then the grandson, who's still school age, has to decide what to do or come to terms with this. And while he's doing that, one day a talking cat appears in the bookshop and says he needs his help. So yeah, this is a grand little book. There was some nice reflections on, why books are important, why reading is important. But it was a little bit like YA feeling for my taste. Just, I suppose, the age of the character and the age of his friends. The plot was a tiny bit simple for my tastes, maybe. But again, coincidentally, this ended at Christmas as well. So yeah, a good month to read it. So yeah, I'm not sure terribly if I'd recommend it, but if you are a big fan of books in this genre and are in the mood for something a bit more lighthearted, it might be one for you. The penultimate book is a reread, and that is The Binding by Bridget Collins. I'd wanted to reread this book ever since I read The Betrayals earlier in the year, because I felt like I just couldn't remember whether I liked this one more than the Betrayals or not. I think I prefer the Betrayals. It's hard because I have conflicted feelings about the ending of the Betrayals, and I don't have conflicted feelings about the ending of this book. I prefer the world and the characters of the Betrayals more. But anyways, this book follows a character called Emmett Farmer. He is a farmer, like his name says, but he's been ill and he's been having these like blackouts and things. And he actually gets called to be an apprentice to a bookbinder, and not just a normal type of bookbinder. It is books in this world contain people's memories, so you can put your memories into a book and then you will forget about it unless you read the book. And as a result, like, books are very much like forbidden things, or like they're a bit like subversive. The world building in this book is brilliant. It's not really clear when it's set, but it probably is like Victorian era, like there's no cars or electronics or anything, but you know, it almost feels kind of steampunk. Probably I wouldn't go that far, but yeah, it feels late Victorian era. Like with the Betrayals, and because of the thing about the books, there is kind of an interesting kind of thing about memories and what you can remember and things in this book. So yeah, I really enjoyed this reread. It's just personal preference for the world of the Betrayals, but yeah, and the one thing I have to say is, if I was a seasonal reader, this would definitely be like a winter read. A lot of the book I think is set in winter, and also there is a references to a holiday called the Turning, which feels very much like our Christmas and New Year. So yeah, it felt very wintry read to me. So the final book I'm going to talk about then, I'm sure this is going to be a very long video, is The Imagination Chamber, Cosmic Rays from Lyra's Universe by Philip Pullman. So this is a selection of very, very, very short snippets that deal with the world of His Dark Materials and the Book of Dust series afterwards. It has characters from that series as well, even though probably most of them are from His Dark Materials. So I really enjoyed this book for what it is. I actually read it. The third series of His Dark Materials is airing on BBC at the moment, and before the first episode, just to get myself into the mood, I read this book, which I'd been saving for a while, and it definitely succeeded in that. I will say there is no extract in this book that's like longer than one page, and it's a small book, but it's not even as big as you would think, because it's like what you used to do in primary school, and the teachers always gave out to you for it. It's only like there's only text printed on the right hand page, and as a result I did feel like the price point, I can't remember how much I paid for this, but I did feel like the price point was quite high for what it is. But I suppose if you do have an appreciation for the world of His Dark Materials and the Book of Dust, you probably would enjoy this. Even a single sentence or two can give you a lot to think about, and it does give like the fates of one particular character after the series, which, you know, was interesting. Also, it was nice that like His Dark Materials books are obviously ostensibly children's books, this dealt with some more like adult themes than would have been possible in those books. So yeah, I wish there was more, but you know, obviously I really enjoyed this book, and what a beautiful book it is as well. I haven't actually read any of the other companion books to that series, but I'm not sure if I want to give him my money because they're not very big. The reason I haven't bought them is they are quite expensive, but I might get them out of the library. Maybe if I like them I'll buy them. It was just a bit of a cheat, wasn't it, to only put text on one side of the page. But anyways, yes, that is it for my December reading wrap up. My mouth is dry talking. So yeah, let me know if you read any of these books. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you been watching series 3 of His Dark Materials? I think it's already aired in the US. I know it's all on BBC iPlayer. I've been watching episode by episode. It is, I think it's a good adaptation. I haven't read The Amber Spyglass in a while, so I can't remember, you know, how much we see of Lord Asriel if there's extra in the television series. I definitely want to reread. I think it'll be a nice reread for like maybe the summer. So yeah. Anyways, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday for my next video.